The frost on the west wall never melted. Not at noon, when the sun sat highest over the valley. Not even when the stove inside had been burning since before dawn. Every other wall in the cabin sweated a little in the daylight, the way old log walls always did. That one wall stayed white, and it stayed cold. And for 2 winters, nobody in the house had thought to ask why. By the 3rd winter, they could not afford not to ask. The wind that year came from a direction the old-timers said it never used to come from. It found the gaps between the logs the way water finds a crack in a dam. Quiet at first, then constant. A boy in the back room had started coughing in October, before the first real frost, and the coughing did not stop when the fire was fed. It only stopped, some nights, when someone sat beside him and kept the blanket pulled to his chin. Down the valley, a neighbor's woodshed had folded in on itself the winter before, under nothing more dramatic than its own weight and a wind nobody had prepared for. People still talked about it like a warning nobody had understood in time. So when the man who built that cabin walked out to the dry creek bed one gray afternoon and began loading stones into a wheelbarrow, nobody thought he was building something better. They thought he had given up on the wall entirely and lost his mind in the process. He was not trying to make the cabin stronger. Not exactly. He was trying to answer a question the frost had been asking for 2 years, one that had nothing to do with logs and everything to do with a piece of ground he had walked past 100 times without truly seeing. What he found in that creek bed would either carry his family through the hardest winter the valley had seen in a decade, or cost him the only shelter they had, weeks before the snow that was already forming somewhere far to the north. If you're watching this from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where in the comments. Stories like this one survive because people still take the time to remember them. And if frontier ingenuity like this means something to you, subscribing helps keep these stories alive. Henrik Solberg had built the cabin himself 3 years earlier, with his own hands and a borrowed team of oxen to haul the heaviest logs up from the tree line. He had been proud of it once. He had stood in the doorway the first winter and told Elsa that no wind in this territory would ever get the better of a wall he had notched and fitted himself. He had been wrong about that, and by the 3rd autumn, the wall was telling him so every night. It came in low along the base of the logs, where the chinking had dried and pulled away in narrow seams, no wider than a finger. On a still evening, a person could hold a candle near the base of the west wall and watch the flame lean sideways, as if something in the room wanted to leave. On a windy one, the draft moved the curtain Elsa had hung over Caleb's bed, even with the door shut and the fire built high. Caleb was 5 years old, small for his age, and the cough had started in the first week of October, weeks before the ground had properly frozen. At first, it seemed like nothing more than the change of season. By the 2nd week, Elsa was sitting up with him past midnight, a hand on his chest, listening to the sound catch and release. Henrik burned wood faster than he had budgeted for. He had counted on the woodpile lasting through February, with careful rationing and a mild stretch in January the way most years allowed. At the rate the stove was eating fuel that autumn, the count no longer worked. He did the arithmetic twice, hoping he had made an error the first time, and got the same number both times. There was no money that year for glass windows shipped in from the rail depot, no money for a second stove, no money to buy in more wood from the mill, even if the mill had wood to sell before its own winter orders came due. What Henrik had was a hillside, a creek that had gone dry with the season, a wife who did not complain but had stopped humming while she worked, and a boy whose breathing had become the only sound either parent listened for. Once, the house went quiet. He stood at the west wall one morning before light, palm flat against the logs, feeling the cold radiate through them like something alive. Somewhere behind that cold, he suspected, was an answer. He simply did not yet know what question to ask. It was Elsa who noticed it first, though she did not think much of it until Henrik asked her to describe exactly what she was seeing. Frost had formed on the inside of the west wall most mornings that autumn, a fine white coating low along the base logs. By midday, when the stove had been running for hours and every other surface in the cabin had dried, that patch of frost remained. Not thinner, not smaller. The same pale rime, morning after morning, as though the wall had its own private winter that never broke for the sun. Henrik had seen frost like that before, though it took him 3 days of turning the memory over to place it. 2 winters earlier, a neighbor named Monroe had lost half his woodshed to a collapse nobody could fully explain at the time. The shed had been sound when it was raised, framed square, roofed properly, but it had faced the same direction as Henrik's west wall, squarely into the corridor where the valley narrowed and funneled the wind down from the higher country to the north. Monroe had blamed a bad winter. Most people had agreed with him, because a bad winter was easier to accept than the alternative, which was that the ground itself, the slope, the exposure, had been working against the structure the whole time. Henrik began walking the property with new eyes. He noticed that the game trails along the ridge above the cabin bent sharply just before reaching open ground, as if the deer themselves preferred not to cross the last exposed stretch in a straight line. He noticed that the one stand of birch trees near the creek grew leaning, permanently curved by a wind that must run through that exact channel for months out of every year. He noticed that his own woodpile, stacked without much thought against the west side of the cabin, dried more slowly than wood stacked along the south wall, even in identical weather. None of it was proof of anything. Not yet. But it was a pattern, and patterns were the one thing Henrik trusted more than luck. Something about that particular stretch of ground pulled cold toward it and held it there, the way a low spot in a field holds water long after the rain has stopped. The logs were not failing because they were poorly built. They were failing because they had been asked to stand in the one place on the property least forgiving of a wall that could not hold its ground. There was a wooden ruler in the bottom of Henrik's tool chest, cracked along one edge and worn pale where a hand had gripped it for decades before his own. It had belonged to his father, a joiner in a coastal town in Sweden, a man who had measured door frames and cabinets for other people's houses his entire working life and never owned much of a house himself. Henrik had brought the ruler across an ocean in a trunk that held almost nothing else of value. He was not a sentimental man by habit, but he kept it close, and on the evening after he first understood the pattern in the frost, he took it out and laid it flat against the west wall, though there was nothing left to measure that a ruler could tell him. He was thinking, instead, about the house his family had left behind. It had flooded twice in 1 decade, a slow, grinding kind of failure that had nothing to do with a single storm and everything to do with a low, unlucky stretch of ground near the harbor that his father had never quite admitted was the true problem. Each time, they had patched what they could and moved on, poorer, and each time his father had told him that a house was only as strong as the ground a man was honest enough to understand. Henrik had promised himself, boarding the ship west with Elsa beside him, and nothing certain waiting on the other side, that he would not repeat that particular kind of stubbornness. He would build where the land wanted a house built, not simply where a person happened to stop walking. He had broken that promise without meaning to. He had chosen this spot for the view down the valley and the nearness of the creek, and he had never once asked the ground itself what it thought of the arrangement. Sitting with the ruler in his hands that night, he understood that fixing the wall was not going to be a matter of better chinking or a thicker coat of clay in the gaps. Something more fundamental than carpentry had gone wrong, and no amount of patching was going to out-argue a hillside that had been funneling cold air into that exact spot for longer than the cabin, or Henrik, or possibly the whole valley's memory, could account for. The decision came to him 3 days later, standing at the dry creek bed with his boots sinking slightly into the gravel, staring at Stone. Fieldstone lay scattered along the creek in every size, rounded smooth by water that had not run in that channel for weeks. Henrik had walked past those stones 100 times without a second thought. Now he picked one up, turned it over, and felt its weight settle in his palm, cold and dense in a way no log had ever felt. If cold air was pooling against that wall, the way water pooled in a low field, then the answer was not to keep fighting it with wood, which breathed, shrank, and cracked with every swing in temperature. The answer might be to build with something that did the opposite of fighting the cold, something heavy enough to simply absorb it, hold it, and release it slowly, on its own schedule rather than the wind's. He would need to pull down the west wall entirely, log by log, and rebuild it in stone, hauled by hand and wheelbarrow from a creek bed nearly a quarter-mile from the cabin. He had perhaps 6 weeks before the first serious snow was expected, based on nothing more scientific than the same signs every family in the valley watched: the geese leaving early, the woodpeckers working harder than usual, an ache Monroe's father used to claim he felt in an old injury before a hard winter. 6 weeks to quarry, haul, and set a stone wall he had never built before, with a coughing 5-year-old sleeping 12 feet from where the work would happen, and a wife who would need to keep a fire going through every one of those weeks without the wall he was about to tear apart. It was not a reasonable plan. Henrik knew that even as he stood there, turning the first stone over in his hand. A man with more money would have ordered milled lumber and better chinking from the rail depot and called it solved. A man with more time would have waited for spring, tested the ground properly, built something considered instead of something desperate. Henrik had neither money nor time. What he had was a pattern he trusted, a creek bed full of stone nobody else wanted, and a promise made to a father who had died believing that ground. More than anything, a man built on top of it, decided who survived a hard season and who did not. He filled the wheelbarrow and started walking back toward the cabin. Monroe arrived on the second day of hauling, drawn by the sight of a wheelbarrow track worn into the grass between the creek and the cabin. He was the kind of neighbor who noticed things without needing to be told, and he stood at the edge of the half-stripped wall for a long moment before he said anything at all. "You're pulling down a wall that's still standing," he said finally, "to build one you've never built before, 6 weeks ahead of snow." Henrik did not argue the point, because it was not wrong. Monroe had been in the valley longer than any other family, had raised 3 sons on it, and had buried a wife on the hillside behind his own house. When Monroe doubted something, he doubted it with the weight of 30 winters behind him, not out of spite. He laid out his concerns the way a man lays out tools he expects to need. Stone was heavy, heavier than green lumber by a wide margin, and a foundation built for a log wall might not carry it without settling unevenly and opening cracks worse than the ones already letting the wind through. Stone also held moisture if it was not set correctly, and a damp wall in a cold climate could crack apart from the inside as water froze and expanded in the gaps. The exact kind of slow failure that had taken his own woodshed 2 winters back, though he had never said so plainly until now. And there was the matter of time. A stone wall raised in haste, without the mortar curing properly in the cold, was a wall built to fail exactly when it was needed most. Elsa stood in the doorway during most of this, arms folded against the chill, saying nothing. She trusted Henrik's instincts more than most, but she had also watched 3 of Monroe's assessments prove correct over the years, and she did not think her husband was wrong to listen. "I'm not asking you to believe it will work," Henrik told Monroe, setting down the stone he had been carrying. I'm asking what would make it more likely to. Monroe studied him for a while, the way a man studies weather before deciding whether to trust it. Then he said the coldest, most useful thing anyone had told Henrik in weeks, that a wall was only as good as what it stood on, and no amount of good stone would save him if he did not solve that first. He did not offer to help. He did not need to. He had given Henrik the one question that mattered before another stone went up. By the end of the first week, Henrik had a section of wall standing roughly waist-high, stones fitted as tightly as he could manage by eye, packed with clay and gravel, in the gaps the way he vaguely remembered seeing done on a barn foundation back in Sweden. It was slow work, and his hands had split and cracked from handling wet stone in falling temperatures, but the wall was rising, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself something close to confidence. The confidence lasted until the middle of that night, when a sound like a shelf of dishes falling woke the whole cabin at once. Henrik went out with a lantern to find nearly a third of the new wall collapsed into a loose scatter of stone and clay, the work of 6 full days undone in the time it took him to walk from the cabin door to the wall itself. He stood there a long moment, lantern light shaking slightly, not from the cold. In the morning, working it through with cold hands and colder patience, he understood what had happened. He had been stacking stone the way a person stacks firewood, largest at the bottom, smaller pieces wedged wherever they seemed to fit, trusting the clay to hold everything together like mortar was meant to. But he had used too little clay in some places, too much in others, and every joint in the wall lined up almost directly above the joint beneath it, seam stacked on seam, with no stone bridging the gap between 2 below it. There was nothing tying the wall together laterally. It had been, in the truest sense, a pile pretending to be a wall. Elsa found him sitting on an overturned stone that afternoon, staring at the collapse, and she did not offer comfort so much as a question. She asked him what a wall was supposed to do that a pile could not. Henrik did not have an answer yet, but the question stayed with him longer than the frustration did, and that, more than anything else that week, felt like progress. The answer, when it came, was standing on his own property the entire time, half buried and mostly forgotten. Behind the cabin, dug into the slope years before Henrik had arrived, sat the remains of a root cellar left by whoever had claimed the land first. Henrik had used it for storing potatoes and turnips without ever paying much attention to how it had been built. Now, with a lantern and a morning to spare, he climbed down into it and studied the walls the way he should have studied them from the beginning. The stones in the cellar walls were not stacked in straight rows. Each layer sat offset from the one below it, so that no vertical seam ran higher than a single course before being interrupted by solid stone above and below. Every stone bridged 2 stones beneath it, the way a bricklayer staggered brick joints without needing to be told why. That single choice, Henrik realized, was what turned a stack of loose rock into something that behaved like one continuous surface, each stone locking its neighbors into place instead of relying on clay alone to hold the whole arrangement together. The wall of the cellar was also thicker than anything Henrik had attempted, packed at its core with smaller broken stone and gravel rather than clay throughout. A dense, heavy rubble fill between 2 faces of larger fitted stones. He pressed a hand against the cellar wall and felt what he had felt on the cabin's cold west wall weeks earlier, except now the coldness meant something different. This wall was not failing to hold heat. It had never been asked to. Its entire purpose was to stay at a steady, unmoving temperature no matter what the surface world was doing. Cold enough in summer to keep vegetables from spoiling, insulated enough in winter to keep them from freezing solid. He climbed out of the cellar with clay under his fingernails, and a plan taking shape that had nothing to do with luck. He would rebuild the collapsed section with staggered joints, a rubble core packed tight between two faces of stone, and enough clay worked into every gap to bind it without drowning the wall in moisture it could not shed before the freeze set in. For the first time since pulling down the first log, Henrik believed he understood what he was actually building. The rebuilt section held through its first real test on a morning 10 days later, when the temperature dropped well below the freezing mark overnight, and stayed there past sunrise. Henrik woke before Elsa and walked straight to the wall, palm flat against the stone the way he had done so many times against the old logs. What he felt stopped him where he stood. The stone was not warm, not by any reasonable measure, but it held a faint, steady difference from the bitter air outside, warmer than the floor, warmer than the untouched section of log wall still standing at the corner, warmer than it had any obvious right to be with the fire banked low overnight. Caleb, wrapped in a blanket by the stove, slept through the whole night without waking once, the first full night's sleep any of them could remember since the cough began. It was not victory. Henrik understood that even as the small relief settled into his chest. The stone section covered perhaps 2/3 of the wall, and a gap remained at the corner where the new stonework met the old roofline. A seam he had not yet found time to properly close. That morning, standing outside in the cold with his breath fogging in front of him, he noticed a thin, persistent draft slipping through exactly that corner, cold enough to feel against the back of his hand from several feet away. The stone was doing exactly what he had hoped. But a wall was only as strong as its weakest joint, and he had left the weakest joint for last, assuming there would be time to return to it before the real weather arrived. Monroe's warning came back to him unbidden. A wall was only as good as what it stood on, and Henrik was beginning to suspect that applied to more than just the foundation. It applied to every seam a man was tempted to leave for later. He had 6 days left by his own rough count, before the sky over the valley started looking like the kind of sky that did not forgive unfinished work. Monroe came back on the 11th day, not to check on the wall out of curiosity this time, but because his own woodshed, rebuilt hastily after the collapse 2 winters earlier, had begun showing the same telltale frost pattern Henrik had described to him weeks before. He stood at the edge of Henrik's yard longer than necessary before finally admitting it. His shed faced the same general direction as Henrik's old west wall, down the same corridor of wind funneling off the higher ground. He had rebuilt it the way he always built things, the way his father had taught him, without ever once asking whether the ground itself had an opinion on the matter. Henrik felt something complicated settle in his chest as Monroe spoke. Weeks earlier, this same man had stood in this same yard and questioned whether the entire project was foolish. Now Monroe was standing there, hat in his hands, asking, without quite managing to say the words outright, how a person went about building a wall that could hold against a wind like that. There was a version of this moment where Henrik kept the knowledge to himself. He had earned it the hard way, through a collapsed wall, split hands, and 6 weeks stolen from a season that offered no spare weeks to steal. Monroe had doubted him publicly, and there would have been a kind of justice in simply saying that some things had to be learned the way Henrik had learned them, through cold mornings and failure. But Henrik thought of Caleb sleeping through the night for the first time in weeks, and of how much of that had depended on things other people had figured out long before either of them. A root cellar dug by hands he would never know, a pattern of staggered stone joints passed down through builders across an ocean. None of what he knew had come from him alone. He walked Monroe over to the section of wall that was holding and explained what he had learned. The staggered joints, the rubble core, the danger of trusting clay to do a stone's job. It cost him nothing but time, and it cost him the last of whatever resentment had been sitting quietly under the surface since that first skeptical visit. Monroe did not thank him extravagantly. He simply nodded, the way men in that valley nodded when something mattered too much for more words, and walked back toward his own place with a new plan forming behind his eyes. The corner seam remained unfinished on the 12th day, and the sky that morning had taken on the flat, heavy gray that everyone in the valley had learned to read as a warning rather than a mood. Henrik worked through the daylight hours packing clay into the gap, where the new stone met the old roofline, testing and retesting the fit, aware that a rushed joint here could undo 6 weeks of careful work in a single bad night. The wood supply had thinned further than he liked. Most of it burned, keeping the cabin livable while the wall itself remained unfinished, and he did not have enough dry fuel left to comfortably outlast more than a week of serious cold if the corner failed to hold. Caleb's cough had eased over the past several nights, but had not disappeared entirely, a small persistent reminder of exactly what was riding on the next few days going right. That evening, a rider passed along the valley road, bringing word that a serious storm system was moving down from the north, expected within 2 to 3 days, colder and longer than anything the region had seen since before Henrik had arrived. Families up and down the valley began the familiar scramble, checking stores, patching what they could, bringing animals in closer to shelter. Henrik stood at the unfinished corner as the light failed, running his hand along the seam one more time. The stonework below it was sound. The stonework above it, where it met the old roofline, was the last untested piece of the entire wall, packed with clay that had barely had 2 days to begin setting in temperatures already dropping toward freezing overnight. He did not know if 2 days of curing in this cold was going to be enough. He had run out of time to find out any other way than living through it. Elsa came out to stand beside him as the first thin snow began drifting down, more warning than storm. Neither of them said much. There was nothing left to do that night but wait for the weather that was already on its way. The storm arrived 2 nights later, not gradually, but all at once, the wind rising from a low, steady moan to something that rattled the shutters within the space of an hour. For the first stretch of the night, the wall held exactly as Henrik had hoped. The stove stayed warm, the stone stayed steady against the worst gusts, and Caleb slept without stirring, while Elsa dozed beside him in the chair she had refused to leave. It was well past midnight when the wind shifted. It had been driving straight into the face of the wall for hours, the direction Henrik had built for, tested for, and understood. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, it swung, curling around the corner of the cabin from an angle none of the frost patterns or game trails had ever warned him about, and it found the one seam that had barely had 2 days to cure. Elsa felt it before Henrik did, a thin, cold line crossing the room near the corner. And Caleb woke coughing within minutes, the sound sharper than it had been in over a week. Henrik was out of bed and at the corner with a lantern before Elsa had finished calling his name. The clay along the seam had not failed outright, but a hairline gap had opened where the curing mortar met the old roof line, just wide enough to let wind through in narrow, cutting threads. There was no time to rebuild anything. There was only time to answer the problem with whatever was on hand. He packed the gap with a mixture of damp clay and twisted straw, working by lantern light with fingers going numb, while Elsa held a blanket up against the wall from the inside to slow the draft, while the packing had a chance to hold. Neither of them knew, in that hour, whether it would be enough to last until the wind either eased or found another way in. They worked because waiting to find out was worse than doing something, even something uncertain, with the storm still climbing outside. The wind broke some time before dawn, the way bad weather in that valley often did, dropping off almost as suddenly as it had risen. Henrik had not slept, neither had Elsa, but the seam had held through the worst of it, the straw and clay packing swollen tight and cold but unbroken, and Caleb, when the light finally came up gray and pale, was breathing easier than he had in that entire storm. Outside, the valley told its own story. 2 families along the lower road had lost significant portions of their woodpiles to a roof collapse that let snow bury what should have stayed dry. A neighbor further up had spent the night moving livestock twice, chasing warmth from one failing shelter to another. Monroe's rebuilt woodshed, reinforced in the days after his conversation with Henrik, had held, standing quiet and intact against a wind that had taken down worse. Monroe walked over that morning without being asked, the way he had walked over weeks earlier to shake his head at a half-finished wall. This time he said nothing about October, nothing about the doubts he had voiced with good reason at the time. He simply stood at the base of the stone wall, ran a hand along it the way Henrik had done so many times himself, and nodded once. Word of the wall moved through the valley slower than the storm had, the way most useful things did out there. One conversation at a time, one winter proving what argument alone never could. By the following autumn, 2 other families had begun their own stone walls facing into the same wind corridor, using what Henrik had learned the hard way, and had chosen in the end not to keep to himself. The wall itself was never beautiful. It bore the marks of every mistake that had gone into it, uneven in places, patched at the corner where a hairline gap had nearly cost them everything. But it stood through that winter, and the ones that followed, steady and unremarkable in the way that only truly solid things manage to be. The wall had never been about the stone. It had been about a family finally taking the time to ask the ground an honest question and having the patience to listen to what it answered. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.